So this video is based on balance of payments, and it's one of the macroeconomic objectives, and often there's a misconception as to what balance of payments actually mean. Many times students might believe that if you improve your balance of payments, then you're improving your international trade and you're in a situation where you're exporting more than you're importing, but that's actually not entirely accurate. When you're looking at balance of payments, we have to break it down into three major categories. The three major categories is your current account, your capital account and your financial account. Now, your current account is what you'll see more media press about. So, for example, if you read newspapers or you're watching the news, often the current account is the one that we're focusing on in terms of international trade. And it's broken down into four major categories. The first category is your trading goods, which is also known as your visibles. Your trading services, which is known as your invisibles, and then you've got your net primary income and your secondary net income. Now, if it's a negative, so that could be your primary and secondary net income being negative, or you've got a negative in trading goods or whatever it might be, then you're probably going to be having a deficit. And what that means is more money flowing out of the country than what's flowing into the country. If you've got a positive, so for example, positive trading services, then you'll have a surplus within that category. And that means more money is flowing into the country than what's flowing out based on that category. So when we look at the current picture and we think about 2020, at the moment, trading goods is a deficit. In brackets, you've got your minus 2.8 billion. So we're obviously very, very reliant on buying, whether that's capital goods, consumer goods, whether that's inputs or commodities, buying them from abroad. Our trading services is very healthy, and we've got a surplus of 6.3 billion. But our net primary income and our net secondary income are both negative, which brings about the overall current account deficit being at 0.6 billion. Now, the net secondary income, that's going to slightly change over the next couple of years. For one reason, because we haven't got those EU contributions, and also Rishi Sunak just the other day was saying that he's actually going to cut and not honour the promise that he has made in terms of foreign aid. So when we break it down, trading goods, as I mentioned before, your consumer, your capital, your inputs, with your trading services, which the UK specialise in, so it could be financial services, insurance services, business services, whatever it might be. Your net primary income is to do with, let's imagine that you've got a company that's operating overseas and the profit that flows back into the country would be within that. Or if you're working overseas and you're sending your wages back home and there's wage remittances, again, they'll be coming back. If it was, for example, you've got shares abroad and you're getting a payment of dividends and that's coming back, that would be in your net primary income. And if it's positive, then obviously more money is flowing in. If it's negative, it's going out. With your net secondary income, I've already mentioned a couple of examples, but as a developed country, we have kind of that moral duty to help some of those countries that are developing. And that could be to do with maybe just in terms of general development. It could be because the country's experienced a natural disaster and need assistance. It could be because of civil unrest, wherever it might be. Because we are transferring that money to another country, but we're not getting anything in return in terms of output, that's considered an international transfer within your net secondary income. Now, in terms of the contribution towards GDP, this is based on January to March of this year, but as it stands, it's 3.8% of gross domestic product. Now, it's worth remembering that actually net exports is the smallest contribution towards GDP. Obviously, it depends on the scenario, it depends on the time, but what we tend to have is the UK is a consumer-heavy economy, so a lot of the contribution towards GDP comes from consumption, followed by investment and government expenditure. Now, clearly government expenditure will depend on the economic cycle, and it depends if there's the need for discretionary fiscal policy. But even then, with current capital ongoing expenditure, it's still higher than net exports. Now, in terms of how we calculate balance of payments, I'm just going to quickly show you by the visual as to how balance of payments is actually measured with those three categories. So when we consider the picture of balance of payments, on one side of the equation we've got our current account, and often the misconception is that we just consider the current account as our balance of payments, which is not true. And therefore, when some students may say, "Oh, we need to improve our balance of payments," well, what do you actually mean by that? Because your balance of payments should actually always equal to zero. So if you think that actually the reason we need to improve it is because of the current account, then we should be saying we need to improve our current account deficit if that's the situation. But let's imagine we've got a current account deficit like the UK do. If there's a current account deficit and we need to balance it out to zero, then that must mean that we have a capital and financial account surplus. Because the capital and financial account surplus is what funds the ability to have a current account deficit. And when that's the case, then therefore we should have a balance of payments which is zero. Now we could think about it from this point of view. So the UK, they have a current account deficit because they import too many goods. All right. So if the UK import too many goods, and let's imagine they're importing cars from Germany. All right. So they've imported a significant volume of cars from Germany, but by doing so, they're exporting the capital to pay for those cars. So the cars are coming into the UK, but actually the UK is then exporting the cash or the currency to be able to therefore then pay for those cars. So that would obviously be a current account deficit, but that would contribute towards a capital and financial account surplus. So that's one aspect, but it's not the whole picture. Okay, so within the capital and financial account, how we can break it down into the different components of each one. With the capital account, you've got your sale or transfers of intellectual property. So it could be your patents, it could be your copyright, it could be franchises or leases, but also transfer of ownership of fixed assets. So what I mean by fixed assets are those assets that actually take a long time to be able to be, I suppose, converted into cash. So it could be, for example, land. So if there's maybe foreign inflows coming into the country to buy land, then obviously we're selling off those fixed assets to foreign customers. We've also got the financial account. The financial account includes transactions such as, again, financial assets and liabilities between the UK residents and non-residents. That could be in terms of if we've had to borrow to fund that current account deficit, that would be within it. Or it could be in terms of, again, the cash that I mentioned earlier in terms of buying cars from Germany and that cash flowing out of the country. It could be that the net foreign direct investment. So what I mean by foreign direct investment is if you've got, for example, Google setting up headquarters in the UK and they're purchasing our capital at all factors of production, and there may be that inflow of money in terms of setting up and running that company within our country, that would be FDI. Or it could be investment portfolios. And what I mean by that is debt and equities. So for example, if you're buying, or a foreign investor is buying shares or bonds within UK firms, that would be as part of the financial account. And it could even be your hot money inflows and your hot money outflows. Now, I'm just going to show you, a quick video based on why the UK is able to fund its current account deficit with their capital and financial accounts. And a lot of it comes from investment portfolios, a lot of it comes from foreign direct investment. But why? What makes UK so attractive? And this video will kind of explore that.
And I'm delighted that we have with us Michael Boyd, who's the Managing Director Investment at UKTI. So Michael, despite uncertainties across world markets, the UK is continuing to attract record levels of investment. And we surpassed, I think, the £1 trillion mark in 2014. So what are the key factors that are driving that investment into the UK?
I think the key factor, Sharon, is that on a competitive basis, we're a very attractive location. We have been, I think, really since records began, but I'm not complacent about it, the leading location in Europe for FDI. And last year attracted nearly 2,000 projects, of which we at UKTI were involved with about 80% of them. The reasons for investing in the UK are primarily driven by our attractiveness on a competitive basis. So one gets headlines like our access to skills, having 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, having a strong apprenticeship scheme, having full employment. Access to skills is extremely important. Taxation is extremely important. When I started this role in 2011, the corporate tax rate was 28%. It's now heading towards 18%. So government policy in terms of making the UK attractive plays a very strong part in our competitiveness. So it's also about our transparency, consistency, which is obviously what investors want to see when they're modelling where to base, say, their European headquarters.
Okay, so a number of key reasons why the UK is very attractive. Yeah. And just in terms of who those investors are, the US and Europe remain the largest investors, I think, into the UK, with India in third position. So I suppose it's interesting, are there strategies in place, and if so, what are they, to broaden that international investor base, and specifically China and the Middle East, say?
We have three goals as an organisation. The first is to increase that £1 trillion of stock of inward investment by 2020 to £1.5 trillion. The second is to retain our leadership position as FDI location from overseas. And the third is to become the number one location for emerging countries, and particularly when we're talking about emerging countries, we're talking about the high growth countries. So there are 23 countries in that basket. So yes, we do have strategies. When I took over this role, we were in 32 countries with investment offices. Now, clearly, if you're focusing on emerging high growth countries, you have to widen that base. So we thought about, well, how can we do that at pace? And actually, we used firms such as Deloitte to expand our network. And said, look, you've got networks in these countries. And we moved into another 19 countries on top of that. So Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Gulf were the primary areas, and Russia. And we did that through using outsourced contracts to attract investment leads, and then to incentivize our partners to bring in those leads, and then we put them into our pipeline and worked on those leads together with our partners, and we've had some very successful.
So you can see that obviously the UK is an attractive place. It's got stable growth. It's got it's English speaking, which you have to remember, the English language is still the mother tongue of globalization. It might change in the future, but at the moment it's still the case. Our education is obviously very, very sophisticated and advanced. We've got the infrastructure, and also we're consumer orientated. So in terms of consumption is a driving force of our GDP. So it's attractive. But you have to remember that because of all this, we are still a net borrower from the rest of the world. And also, if we're going to be selling off some of our assets, that means those assets are now in international hands, and we do not own them as the UK, which can be risky in itself. But a current account deficit places the UK as a net borrower of the rest of the world, indicating that overall expenditure in the UK exceeds national income. So the UK must attract those net financial inflows to finance this current account deficit, which, as you can see from the last video, they are doing. The worry is, I suppose, if we do experience any economic shock, could that FDI or those investment portfolios inflows, could they start to dry up? And that might be a worry, because if we cannot fund the current account deficit because of FDI or investment portfolios falling, then we'd have to fund it in other ways. And that could be where liabilities come into place and there's financial obligations in terms of borrowing. And even if that's the case, we need to make sure that actually we are able to borrow and foreign governments, for example, are willing to lend to us. Now, as I've put there as well, it can be achieved through either disposing of overseas assets to overseas investors or accruing those liabilities which I've just mentioned. Now, Again, some evaluative points. If the current account deficit worsens, it needs to be funded. So how will it be funded? Will it be by borrowing? Will it be by trying to attract FDI? Will it be trying to attract investment portfolio inflows? Could it be to try and maybe increase hot money inflows? You have to consider ways because it needs to be funded. And if all the other options are not available, then we will have to borrow. And that obviously is that debt financial obligation. The UK currently is attractive. It's got that developed status, it's got that global reputation, but things change. Other countries become more attractive. Other countries, they're constantly developing, and they might be, or they might take up some of the FDI that was coming into our country. But also economic shocks. We've got Brexit, we've got COVID-19. They are massive risks in terms of those FDI and investment portfolio inflows. Now, with COVID-19, obviously it's impacting the whole world, so it might not be completely detrimental to the UK, but it could dry up some of it because investors start becoming risk averse and might start being a little bit more, I suppose, kind of slowing down their investment decisions, which could impact the UK. But Brexit, I would argue, is a major worry because obviously the UK is often used as that portal to the rest of Europe. And obviously Europe is our biggest trading partner. So that is going to have a significant impact, but we're not really sure what that impact will be. There's a lot of speculation and there's some very, very senior economists that have had an opinion. And actually what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a video based on, again, an economist who worked for the central bank, who had very, very strong views as to what this meant for the UK and possibly their balance of payments.
What are the implications? Well, the implication is very simple. The UK economy is going to suffer what we call a negative supply shock, and in fact is already doing so. What is a negative supply shock? A negative supply shock means you are reducing the productive capacity of your economy or the ability of your economy to purchase things for the same amount of money as you used to. And this takes several forms. Fundamentally, and again, this is something that I would hope in AEI would be religion. It is across the street at my shop. Putting up trade barriers is bad for your economy. The withdrawal from the EU is a form of putting up trade barriers. Full stop. Now, you can debate how much, how big, which industries, what happens in the end, but it is a withdrawal. Moreover, and this relates to some of the things Ambassador O'Sullivan said, it is a negative supply shock in that you are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life, that gravity applies. What is gravity? You trade far, far more with the countries you are contiguous with and the countries that you historically have interacted with than with countries that are far away. That is true for the US in the context of NAFTA. That is true for the UK. No matter how much there's been a special relationship, no matter how much the UK tries to be a global exporter, the fact is you've got more than twice as much trade with the EU, more than twice as much investment with the EU as you do with the US, or let alone the rest of the world. As David Cameron pointed out when Prime Minister while I was at the Bank of England, the UK does more trade with Ireland than they do with the BRIC countries combined, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is negative, full stop. And even if we were to get the kind of UK-US trade deal that Ambassador Bolton puts forward, I don't think we will, and I'll explain that at the very end if we have time. But even if we were, it would not matter very much compared to this shock. Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand. Those production will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access. Fourth, there's a distinction that gets made, and it was sort of there in Ambassador Bolton, and it was more there in Ambassador O'Sullivan's comments, which is important. There's a distinction between a trade deal and access to the single market. The single market is covering all those things that aren't simply the price of goods off the boat. It's whether your auto meets safety standards. It's whether your chemicals or your food additives have been recognized. It's whether you fit standard sizes of various objects. It's whether your accountants are accredited. It's whether your university degree is recognized in other countries' universities. Now, there's a large body of research in the US and Europe, some of it written at AEI, that says many of these things are restraints from trade. In reality, they are partially restraints from trade and partially economically beneficial because they set standards and make it easier to have large markets. In any given industry, there'll be more or less of those attributes. But so then the question is, since the UK primarily is an exporter of high-end products and of services especially, financial services, business services, media services, cultural services, educational services, how much do they lose by not being in the single market, even if you have a trade deal? And the answer is a lot. Most of the financial regulation that affected the UK was set in the UK and was not set by Brussels. And while the UK was in the EU, they had a predominant voice in the setting of those regulations in Brussels. Now, there will be no such interest. And that is why we are seeing, on estimates of my colleague Simeon Jankov, who runs the financial markets group at the London School of Economics, a third of city jobs, the economic and financial jobs in the city of London, will be moving to Dublin, Frankfurt, New York. So, full stop, this is bad economically.